This is our second installment of Snow Day class, so I apologize for these online lectures. They're just not as good as being in person. At least I don't enjoy them as much, but hopefully we will be able to keep up with our material and we won't get too far behind. On that subject, I wanted to start off with a reminder about the storyline or the outline of the drama, which you read last week or the week before. I encourage you to keep up with this. I suggested printing it off and keeping it with you. Sometimes in the quiz, I'll ask you, where do the events that you read about today fall on the timeline? So I want to just situate us here today because we've already made it through the first two acts and we are in the third act of the biblical drama. Now, if you've been keeping up with your reading in the True Story book, then you should know exactly what I'm talking about here. So if we just expand that first part of the outline, we see that Act 1 is creation. God establishes his kingdom. Act 2 is the fall, which we talked about earlier this week. And then Act 3 is the beginning of redemption. And you see redemption in Act 3 is oriented around a king. We'll come to kingship pretty quickly. But right now, we're just in that scene 1.2. So scene 1 is the creation of a people, rising tide of sin, that's the flood and the Tower of Babel that we saw last time, the recovery plan for creation, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We're looking at Abraham today. Freed from slavery, that's the Exodus story, which we'll pick up with next week. So I just want you to be situated and to know where we're at. Again, that could come up in a quiz, so keep that handy. Pay attention to where we are in the biblical drama. You should be able to tell at this point that most of the Old Testament, from Genesis 3 all the way through the end, fits into Act 3. Act 1 is Genesis 1 and 2. Act 2 is really just Genesis 3. And then we get the rest of the Old Testament. I think I said this at the outset, but I'll say it again. This is just one way to understand the biblical story. It's not the only way. This is based on a metaphor of kingship and government. That's not the only kind of metaphor we can use to talk about the biblical story. It just is a convenient one for us because of the book that we've chosen. So keep those things in mind as we're going. We're first introduced to Abraham under a different name, Abram, at the very end of Genesis 11. We meet Abram and his father, Terah, and his nephew, Lot. And we meet Abraham's wife, Sarai, who will later be known as Sarah. And they are leaving Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. This is really all we know about them at this point, is that they are from Ur of the Chaldeans. So, where is Ur of the Chaldeans? Well, Ur is one of the great cities. It's actually a historical city. There are archaeological remains of it. But Ur is in the region of Babylon. Now, we just talked about earlier in chapter 11 the Tower of Babel. And at this point, you should have made the association between the Tower of Babel and the Empire of Babylon. Also, keep in mind, if we're jumping historically, when was this material put together? When Israel was in Babylon in exile. So the stories that we're reading about here reflect something of their experience in Babylon. So Ur, where Abraham comes from, is Babylon. And it's no accident that the story of Babylon, in chapter 11, comes right before the story of Abraham, who is leaving Babel or Babylon. So here I've given you a picture of the great ziggurat from Ur. The Tower of Babel is, of course, modeled on a ziggurat. And then this other image is U.S. soldiers climbing that remains of the ziggurat, which is still there, even though it's almost 4,000 years old. So tremendous. Here's a map just to situate us. And one thing to note here, those early stories in Genesis are kind of connected with prehistory. They're difficult to locate geographically. There's no Garden of Eden on a map. But as we move into the Abraham story, we're getting into more historical information. So cities like Ur are historical. We can point to them. We have archaeological remains of some of these things, though not of Abraham himself. So you can see on this map between the rivers of the Tigris and the Euphrates, that's called Mesopotamia. Ur is there in the south, Sumer close to the Persian Gulf. And this is the route that the Bible reports for Terah and his family as they travel from Ur ultimately to Canaan. So we know where he's coming from. We know he's leaving with his family from the great city Ur, or Babylon. But then the first thing we hear is the call. And this is an interesting story. It's Genesis 12. This is really where the Abraham story picks up. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the ones who curse you I will curse, and in you all families of the earth shall be blessed." This is Abraham's call. This is a revelation to Abraham. We talked about revelation a little bit ago. And we'll come back to some of the details of this in a minute. But right now, I want you to contrast what we see here with what we just saw in the Babel story. Now, if you remember, Babel is a symbol for sin. Not just personal sin, but social sin. This is all of humanity is involved in this story. So what does that look like? We talked a little bit last time at the very end of the lecture about empires and how empires are broken and fallen because of their violence, because of their acquisitiveness and exploitation, because of their arrogance and pride. We can actually set side by side the story of Babel and the story of Abraham and notice some interesting parallels. So the people of Babel sought to settle on the plains of Shinar, whereas Abraham is depicted as someone who doesn't settle. He's a wanderer. Similarly, when the people settled in Babel, they wanted to build a city. Abraham, on the other hand, is called to leave a city. In Babel, the reason that the people give for building the tower to heaven is because they want to make a name for themselves. Abraham, notably, in chapter 12, verse 2, God says, "I will give you a name," or "I will make your name great." And then at Babel, they're building this tower in order to overthrow God in the city and to take God's place. Whereas the Abraham story depicts Abraham as seeking God in the wilderness. So you should be able to see now that Abraham is being depicted as a kind of fresh start for humanity. The human race has fallen deep into sin and rebellion to the point where they're trying to, in the story, actually storm heaven and replace God. They're not going to wait for God to bless them. They're going to bless themselves. They're not going to wait for God to give them a name or make them great. They're going to make themselves great. We're going to be a great nation. We're going to make the earth great. Abraham, by contrast, waits, receives God. Abraham doesn't build this great city. He actually leaves the human city to go out into the wilderness. So in all these points of contrast, we see the text is depicting Abraham as a kind of new Adam. Remember, Adam and Eve failed to trust God, even though God had surrounded them with all the good gifts. Well, Abraham is going to be one who is learning to trust in God's providence. Abraham is a wanderer. He's not settled and taking care of himself. He's wandering in the desert like a nomad. So God will have to provide for him. Cities are places where there is security and protection. There's gigantic walls around Ur of the Chaldees. But Abraham leaves the protection of the city walls, and he trusts God for protection in the wilderness. Prestige or recognition. I can go out and, write songs and get on television or the internet, become a celebrity, make a name for myself. But Abraham doesn't try to achieve fame or fortune. He trusts God to give him a name, to recognize and to know him. And then finally, Abraham doesn't try to replace God or find a substitute for God, but he pursues God's presence. Just like God was walking in the cool of the evening in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, Abraham is seeking that same kind of real presence, real relationship with God. So in all these ways, Abraham is presented as a new Adam, or a fresh start for creation, a new beginning. And that's why in the True Story book, this is called the initiation of redemption. What I want to focus on in this lecture is the mechanics of redemption, what this actually looks like to learn to trust God, to restore that broken relationship. So it begins with leaving Babylon. He has to leave the city. Again, the Tower of Babel is a symbol of sin. He has to leave the city. Does this mean all cities are bad? Well, no. Actually, we're going to see the Bible ends in Revelation 21 and 22 with the holy city, which is the symbol of heaven. So the biblical narrative redeems cities ultimately. But right now, in the early chapters of Genesis, cities are a symbol of human greed and arrogance and violence. So first, Abraham has to leave all of that. It also says that he has to leave his father's home. Some of you have experienced this. If you're freshmen, you've recently left your family's home and you moved to college. And that's a good thing. It's an important part of growing up, but it can be a little scary because up until this point, for most of us, our families have taken care of us. They provided the food. They took care of the bills. They made sure that transportation needs were arranged and so on. They were our security net. If you have a family with like good credit scores and all, then you shared in their good credit or their good standing in the community. Tradition is that Abraham's family was wealthy and prominent. So, of course, as a wealthy family, they had certain privileges. Well, here Abraham is leaving all of that. God is asking him to go away and to no longer rely on his family, daddy's checkbook, his own name, to no longer rely even on his own abilities, but to fully and completely put himself into the hands of God. I said I'd come back to some of the details there in chapter 12. This is often called the beginning of the covenant. Now, a covenant is simply a relationship or agreement between two parties which involves certain promises. God is asking a lot of Abraham in the story to leave his family, to leave security, to leave behind all that he knew. But in return, God says, if you learn to trust me, and if you teach your children to trust me, then you will become a great nation, and through your offspring, the whole world will be blessed. So there's a reciprocity here. If you do this, then this will happen. The promise with Abraham is just one of several covenants that take place in the Old Testament. And most of these we'll spend some time looking at as we keep going through the story. We skipped over the covenant with Noah in Genesis 9. This is what happens after the flood. And here God promises never to flood the world with water again. There's an agreement between God and Noah, God and the people. We just looked at the covenant with Abraham, which actually is repeated in Genesis 15 and again in Genesis 17. Later we'll see the covenant made with Moses and with the people of Israel, and then with David. This covenant introduces kingship. And then ultimately we'll look at something called the New Covenant, which is something that is meant to be more permanent than any of these covenants that have come before. And this brings us right into the New Testament, which is actually just another way of saying the New Covenant book. So we'll be looking at these, keep an eye on these different covenants. And what this is meant to show is a kind of increasing intimacy in the relationship between God and the people. The promise deepens, and as the relationship deepens. We could talk about the signs of each of these covenants. So the sign of the Noahic covenant is the rainbow in the sky. The sign of the Abrahamic covenant is the circumcision. The sign of the Mosaic covenant is the tabernacle. The sign of the Davidic covenant is kingship, and so on. So there's generally a physical sign that accompanies each of these promises. Now, Genesis 15 tells a different version of this story. So much later, God comes to Abraham. And by the way, we don't know how God comes to Abraham. Is this a voice that Abraham hears? Is it a dream? Is it a kind of feeling inside of him? We don't know. And it doesn't really matter. The Bible doesn't give us those details. Again, we should be careful about trying too hard to kind of flesh out a movie version of this. That's not the intention of the story. So in this case, it does say that God came to Abram in a vision, maybe a dream. It says, "Don't be afraid, Abram, I'm your shield. Your reward will be very great." So again, a promise. I'll protect you. You'll be rewarded if you trust me. And then it says he brought him outside the tent and said, "Look toward the heaven and count the stars if you're able. So shall your descendants be." Famously, Abraham's children would be like the sands on the seashore and the stars in the sky, uncountable. And so he believed the Lord. And again, believe here not in the sense of there were certain facts about God that he accepted. But the word believe here means he trusted the Lord. He trusted God. And the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. It's the trust which is being rewarded. Something else happens in this chapter, which I just want to point out. It's a covenant ritual. Abraham sacrifices a bunch of animals, a bird, a goat, a cow, and it says he cuts them in two, and he lays the carcasses out, one on each side. So there's that splitting, kind of like we saw Tiamat split. And Abraham sits there with these split animals, and he shoos the flies away. And in his vision or dream, he sees a ball of fire or a torch or something pass through these slain animals, right through the middle of the split corpses. Now, this is part of an ancient covenant ritual, which kings would do. They would open these animals up, and the kings who made the promise with each other would walk through the animals, and they would say something to the effect of, "If I break my promise, may this happen to me. Kill me, split me open. So I'm sealing this covenant with my life." What's extraordinary about Genesis 15 and really about Israel's vision of God is that it's not a human walking through the animals and making this promise, but it's God walking through. And essentially what God is saying is, you can hold me to my word. If I break my promise, kill me. Split me in half. I'm not really a God. I'm not trustworthy. What this means is God is not simply ordering or commanding obedience. God is entering into a reciprocal relationship. God is limiting God's power, limiting God's self for the sake of the other, for the sake of Abraham. So it's a voluntary limitation which allows Abraham to take the risk of trusting in God. God kind of has some skin in the game, as it were. So this is an extraordinary moment which tells us something about this God who we already saw in creation limits himself, pulls himself back to make room for the world. And now we see God further limiting God's self with these promises. If you do this, I will do this. Does God have to keep a promise? Well, presumably no, he's God. This God does have to keep promises, because what this God will be known for is his faithfulness. He is faithful to his word. The word that we'll see later for this is chesed in Hebrew. Chesed is translated in many ways through the Old Testament, but it means steadfast love or covenant love. So everywhere you see my steadfast mercy or my steadfast love, it's associated with a covenant. Now, when you're in a loving relationship with someone, what do you have to do? You have to let them pick out what you're going to watch tonight. You have to let them decide the restaurant. You have to make compromises. You have to limit yourself and your desires, because you're making room for the desires and the person of another. So, again, the relationship with God is really meant to be a mirror of our relationships with each other. That's what it means to be in the image and likeness of God. So how does Abraham become the new person? God doesn't just sprinkle fairy dust on him and he becomes a new Adam and he's magically trusting. Trust is something that has to be learned. You know this because you've been in trusting relationships before. You trust your parents because they've always provided for you and met your needs. If your parents or guardians didn't do that, you probably don't trust them. In fact, you may have trouble trusting any adults if you grew up in that environment. If you've been in a relationship with a significant other, a romantic relationship, you know that trust is something that takes time. If I think you're stepping out, if I think you're talking to other people, I'm not going to trust you, and the relationship isn't going to go very far. So even though the text uses the language of testing, this is not like God giving an exam, like, oh, I wonder what Abraham thinks. I better find out. God already knows, because God knows all. These tests in the biblical story are meant to do something to Abraham. They're formational tests. He's called to be like God, but he must first learn these qualities. What does it mean for humans to trust? What does it mean for humans to receive the gifts of God rather than to take them like the Babylonians? What does it mean for humans to wait on God to act rather than acting for themselves, getting in a hurry, the sin of haste? And Abraham's going to learn this through very ordinary material means, through food, water, through the use of land, and through family, children. I don't have time to spend to go into very much detail about these stories. Hopefully you read them on your own before class today. But I'll just point out a few things about them. The first test is the test of food. It's right there in Genesis 12 after the call narrative. Abraham is led into the land of Canaan, and there's a famine in the land. There's no food. Will God provide for Abraham in his time of need? Can Abraham trust God to provide? Well, he decides not to take the chance, and he packs up his family and he goes down to Egypt. And in Egypt, he lies about his relationship to Sarah. He says, "This is my sister," instead of saying, "This is my wife." The Pharaoh in Egypt falls in love with Sarah and tries to marry her, and then this great plague strikes the land. And anyway, Pharaoh finds out that Abraham's been lying to him, and Abraham's like, "What? She's kind of my sister." And we have this interesting moment where Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, speaks truth. Pharaoh's almost always the bad guy in the story of the Bible. He's a kind of symbol of oppression. But here he speaks truth. Abraham's the liar. Abraham's the bad guy. He's tried to pimp his wife. So Pharaoh ends up sending him a lot of cattle and wealth and sending him back up. But this is you might say, a failed test. Abraham failed to trust God, and he ended up getting himself into more trouble by lying and deceiving Pharaoh. So first test, failure. Second test, Abraham is there in the land of Canaan, and he still has his nephew Lot with him. And both of them are herdsmen. And of course, cattle, sheep, goats, they require a lot of water. So as their herds grow, they realize they're going to have to part ways so that they can find new sources of water. Here, Abraham gives Lot the first option and says, look, you decide where you want to take your flocks, and I'll take the other side. Well, Lot chooses, the text says, the well-watered plains of Sodom. A little background on Sodom. Famous city, or perhaps infamous city. Well, Sodom in the story is a symbol like Babylon. It's a great ancient Near Eastern city. It is a symbol of pride, of violence, of exploitation of labor. So when the text says that Lot chose the well-watered plains of Sodom, it means Lot is being drawn into the city or drawn into this social sin. Here, Abraham passes the test because he actually goes farther into the wilderness. The story goes on to talk about the fate of Sodom. Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed by fire and brimstone. It's a story of violence, of sexual violence. But the story has been misread many times. Of course, Sodom is now a synonym for sexual sin. Sodomy is a sexual sin. And some people think that Sodom is destroyed for sexual depravity, as if sex is like the worst thing you can do. But if we read the whole biblical text, we get a different picture. Much later in the Old Testament, the prophet Ezekiel, he says this, this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. They were haughty and did detestable things before me. Therefore I did away with them, as you have seen. So yeah, they did detestable things. That could include the sexual sins. But more than that, they were arrogant, which is a characteristic of these empires, like Egypt and Babylon and so on. And they neglected the poor. As we will see, God wants his people to take care of the poor and the needy. This is something God himself does. And as God thinks of what a perfect human society looks like, it's a group of people who cares for the weakest among them. So pay attention to that as we keep going. Torah, the laws of Israel, are going to talk a lot about caring for the poor and the needy. These symbols of sin, Sodom, Egypt, Babylon, and so on, they're precisely the places where power, wealth, and fame are privileged, and the poor are neglected. Okay, third test, shelter. Abraham has a mixed record on this. We hear in this section of Genesis the story of Hagar. Hagar is an Egyptian servant who Abraham and Sarah picked up while they were down in Egypt. As you remember, Abraham was promised an heir. God promised to give him a son, but he's getting older and older and he's not having any kids. And so they're frustrated, and Sarah says, look, just sleep with my slave woman and you'll produce an heir. Now, there are a lot of ethical issues with sleeping with your slave women, mainly because it's generally non-consensual. So Abraham has this relationship with his slave woman, and they do produce an heir, Ishmael. And Abraham thinks, okay, this is going to be the chosen one, the chosen son. Well, it turns out Ishmael is not the son of promise. Sarah gets jealous or sick of Hagar, the slave woman, and she says, Abraham, get rid of her. Now Abraham does what Sarah says, and he just sends her out into the wilderness with a canteen of water. It says, kind of, good luck, happy trails. This is obviously a failure. He has just sent away this woman as if she were an animal or something, with no regard for her life, no regard for the life of the child. He has failed to provide shelter to this woman in need. So he's acting like the Sodomites here, or the Egyptians later. So this is a huge failure on his part. Fortunately, in the story, God shows up and cares for Hagar and Ishmael does receive some promises of his own. He too will become the father of great nations, and traditionally, Ishmael is seen to be the father of Islam, and Isaac is seen to be the father of Judaism. So and the story is told actually quite differently in the Quran. The Quran contains a lot of the same stories as the Bible, but often from a different perspective. So that's something that's worth looking into. But that's not the only story of shelter. There's another story in Genesis 18 where these three visitors come down the road, and Abraham sees them, and he welcomes them into his tent. And this is a story which comes to represent Near Eastern hospitality. He feeds the strangers, he takes care of them. There's always a risk with taking strangers in. Your parents probably told you not to pick up hitchhikers. That's because hitchhikers could be axe murderers. But that's true of any stranger. Any person you meet who you don't know could be an axe murderer. Taking in strangers is a risk. But it's the same kind of risk that Abraham took in trusting God. Remember, God was a stranger when he first came to Abraham. So receiving this strange God translates into welcoming or receiving strange people. Because the only way that strange people can become unstrange or become friends is by inviting them to the table and making room for them. So Abraham is a success. He passed this test. He's learning to trust. He's learning to take the risk of trusting others and building relationships. And we see that with the visitors at Mamre in Genesis 18. The fourth and final test is the test of children. Again, his record is mixed on this. He got in a hurry. First he said, I'll make my servant Eleazar the heir, and God said, no, doesn't count. And then he says, I'll sleep with this slave, and that child will be the heir, and God says, no, that's not right. Finally, at age 100, Abraham and Sarah conceive, and a son is born whose name is Isaac. Isaac becomes the son of promise. And it's through Isaac that the story of Abraham will continue through his son Jacob and through the 12 tribes of Jacob, which will eventually become the people of Israel. So there's many false starts and there's many failures. What I hope you see through this story is a couple things. One, Abraham and Sarah are depicted as very human characters. They're very flawed. They make as many mistakes and screw-ups as they do have good things. This is one thing that sets the Old Testament stories apart from, say, the heroic stories of Greece. The Old Testament doesn't shy away from the failures, even the pretty big failures like rape and murder and lying. We're going to see this in all the stories. Abraham is not a great moral person, but morality is not the point here. It's trust. He's learning to trust God, to put himself in God's hands. We're going to see the same thing with King David in a couple of weeks. He's not moral at all. He's, in fact, an awful criminal person in many ways. But he's learning to trust God, and that's why he's favored. So these are humans. 2, the process of becoming like God is a human process which takes place in time and space, and it happens through very real trials around food and shelter and water and family. So we don't learn to trust God by like going and standing in the desert and lifting our hands up, some sort of magical process. It's in the everyday. It's in the calf. It's in the dorm room. It's in the car. That's where this process is happening, this learning to put ourselves in God's hands, to wait for God, to receive God's good gifts rather than taking them for ourselves, to trust rather than saying, I can only trust myself. Now, I'll close with this. This is the story of Abraham sacrificing Isaac, or beginning to sacrifice Isaac. It's in Genesis 22. I will not even attempt to do justice to this story. It's a very difficult and challenging story. God says to Abraham, take your son, your only son, your son Isaac, and go up to a mountain and offer him as a human sacrifice. Now, killing children just seems to be bad all the time. So the story raises questions about God. Does God desire for children to be killed? Does God like human sacrifice? We know that other gods in Canaan did accept the sacrifice of children. We find their skeletons buried in little jars in the desert to this day. So is God just like the Canaanite gods? Why does Abraham say yes to this? What does this say about Abraham? Is this just another example of him trusting? Or should he have argued with God? Should he have said, I won't sacrifice my son Isaac. I won't take life. You're being inconsistent. Now, before you think that would be disrespectful, Abraham had argued with God about Sodom. He did not think God should destroy Sodom. Later in the Bible, we'll see Moses arguing with God and saying, you shouldn't kill people, God. You shouldn't kill Israel. Arguing with God, challenging God, is actually something that is looked upon favorably in Israel. Abraham, Moses, David, others, they challenge, they argue with God, they call God out. Hey, God, that's not in line with your character. Remember, these are stories meant to communicate something symbolically. So how this actually took place, we don't know. But Genesis 22 is a story which has fascinated Jews, Christians, Muslims, secular people for centuries and centuries and centuries. And I want to leave you with this because it's a great example of the way everything in the Bible doesn't just resolve into some sort of tidy picture. And in fact, some of the stories may be there to continue the conversation. People keep coming back to this story and saying, what does it mean? How do we make sense of this? And it gives us something to talk about and a reason to question God. Who is God? What's God like? A reason to question our own responsibility. What does the ethical life look like? If God told me to kill my child, would I do it? Should I do it? So parts of the Bible, I think, are there. One early Christian scholar said, like a pebble in our shoe, just to kind of annoy us, to bug us, to stimulate us to think about God, because asking questions is actually a form of praise. It's pleasing to God to challenge, to push back, and to wonder. Okay, that should be enough. If you didn't see the attendance code earlier, it's 8321, so don't forget to do your attendance. Also, the quiz is up, so don't forget to do the quiz over this. God willing, we will be back together on Monday. See you then.